In the early morning of October 26, 1597, scouts perched on the hills of Jindo Island spotted something that made their blood run cold. Hundreds of Japanese warships, 333 vessels to be exact, were deploying in the waters south of the Myeongnyang Strait. Their sails filled the horizon, their war drums echoed across the water, and they were coming north with a single purpose: to crush the last remnants of Korea's naval resistance and march unopposed to the capital. Standing between this armada and total victory were exactly 13 Korean warships, 13 ships against 333, a force outnumbered 25-1, a naval engagement so lopsided that victory seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. The Japanese commanders were so confident that they sent word back to their generals on land. The Korean navy would be destroyed by sunset, and the Yellow Sea would belong to Japan. But the Japanese had made one fatal miscalculation. Those 13 ships were commanded by Admiral Yi Sun-sin, and Admiral Yi had never lost a naval battle in his entire career. What happened over the next several hours would go down as one of the most stunning military victories in human history. A triumph of tactical genius over overwhelming force. A masterclass in using terrain, timing, and psychological warfare to turn certain defeat into impossible victory. The Battle of Myeongnyang would prove that sometimes, against all odds, 13 ships can hold back an armada, if they're commanded by the right man. This is the story of that battle, the story of how one admiral, facing his darkest hour, devised a trap so brilliant that it turned a narrow strait into a graveyard for Japanese ambitions. The story of courage, innovation, and strategic genius that saved a kingdom and changed the course of history. The year is 1597, and Admiral Yi Sun-sin has just been given an impossible order: defend Korea with only 13 ships, or die trying. To understand how Admiral Yi found himself in this desperate situation, we need to go back several years. The story begins in 1592, when the Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched an audacious plan to conquer not just Korea, but all of China. His strategy was straightforward: use Korea as a land bridge to the Chinese mainland, march through the peninsula with overwhelming force, establish supply lines, then turn north and bring the Ming dynasty to its knees. On paper, it should have worked. Japan fielded one of the most formidable invasion forces ever assembled. 158,000 soldiers landed at Busan in April 1592. Hardened samurai who had spent decades fighting in Japan's civil wars, battle-tested, disciplined, and equipped with modern arquebus firearms that could shred traditional armor. They also brought 700 warships, a fleet designed to maintain their supply lines and control Korea's coastline. Within weeks, the Japanese had captured Busan, smashed through Korean defenses, and were racing northward. Seoul fell. The royal court fled. King Seonjo abandoned his capital and retreated deeper into the peninsula, desperately sending messages to Ming China begging for help. It looked like the conquest of Korea would be complete within months, but there was one problem the Japanese hadn't anticipated: the Korean Navy. And commanding that navy was a relatively unknown officer named Yi Sun-sin. Yi Sun-sin was not an obvious choice for greatness. Born in 1545 into a military family, his path to command was anything but smooth. His father had been a minor government official, his family respectable, but not wealthy or particularly influential. Young Yi grew up hearing stories of Korea's martial traditions, but he showed no prodigious talent for warfare in his youth. He was thoughtful, quiet, more interested in studying military history and strategy than in the flashy displays of swordsmanship that impressed recruiting officers. His first attempt at the military examinations ended in failure. So did his second attempt and his third. Each failure pushed him further from the traditional path to command. In Joseon dynasty Korea, where social status and connections often mattered more than ability, A man who failed his examinations 3 times was seen as mediocre at best. Yi must have felt the weight of those failures, must have wondered if he was meant for military service at all, but he kept trying, and in 1576, at the age of 32, he finally passed. 32 years old for a junior officer position. Most of his peers had passed in their early 20s and were already well into their careers. Yi was starting at the bottom, older than most of his fellow junior officers, with no powerful patrons at court to smooth his path upward. His early postings were exactly what you'd expect for someone with his record. Garrison duty on the northern frontier, defending against nomadic raiders from Manchuria. Small-scale skirmishes, endless patrols. The kind of posts where you could spend decades and never make a name for yourself. Yi served with distinction, but distinction in frontier posts didn't translate to recognition in the capital. He was doing his job well, but nobody important was watching. And yet during these years of obscurity, Yi was developing something rare. He was learning to think about warfare differently than his peers. While other officers focused on traditional tactics, cavalry charges, infantry formations, the kind of land warfare that Korea had practiced for centuries, Yi became fascinated by naval operations. This was unusual. In Joseon dynasty Korea, the navy was considered a secondary service, less prestigious than the army, less important strategically. Most ambitious officers avoided naval postings because that's not where reputations were made. But Yi saw something others missed. He saw that Korea was a peninsula, 3 sides surrounded by water, and if an enemy controlled those waters, they could land troops anywhere, supply armies anywhere, blockade ports and starve cities. Control the sea, and you controlled the strategic initiative. Lose the sea, and you were constantly reacting, never attacking, always vulnerable. When Yi finally received his first naval posting in 1580, serving in the southern coastal regions, he threw himself into understanding everything about maritime warfare. He studied tides with an obsessive attention to detail that his fellow officers found peculiar. He would stand on cliffsides for hours, watching how currents flowed around islands, how wind patterns changed with the seasons, how the water behaved in narrow straits versus open ocean. He interviewed fishermen, asking them about the best and worst places to sail, about hidden rocks and shallow passages that didn't appear on official maps. He also studied ships. Korean naval architecture in the 1580s was good, but not revolutionary. The standard Korean warship, called a panokseon, was a solid, practical vessel, flat-bottomed for stability in coastal waters, multiple decks, capable of carrying cannons and archers. But Yi saw ways to improve them. He sketched modifications in his personal notes, reinforced hulls using thicker oak planking, better cannon placement to allow firing in all directions instead of just forward, improved rudder systems for better maneuverability. Most importantly, Yi understood that naval warfare was fundamentally different from land warfare in one crucial way. The environment itself was a weapon. On land, terrain mattered, but skilled commanders could usually work around unfavourable ground. At sea, if you fought against the current or the wind or the tide, you could do everything else right and still lose. But if you understood those forces, if you could predict them and use them, you could multiply your strength. A smaller fleet in the right position, with the current and wind in their favour, could devastate a larger force. Yi also revolutionised Korean naval training. Before his innovations, Korean sailors were, sailors. They knew how to row, how to manage sails, how to keep a ship afloat, but they weren't warriors. When combat came, they were expected to do their best, but nobody trained them to fight as organised units. Yi changed that. He drilled his crews constantly. He ran practice battles where he would split his small command into opposing forces and have them fight mock engagements, using flags and drum signals to coordinate complex manoeuvres. He taught archers to fire from moving platforms, to compensate for the roll of a ship and the wind. He trained gunners to adjust their aim for range and sea conditions. His fellow officers thought he was being obsessive. Some complained that he was working the sailors too hard, that all this training was unnecessary for peacetime naval operations. But Yi understood something they didn't. He understood that the Japanese were coming, not immediately, not in 1585 or 1586, but someday. Japan had just finished decades of brutal civil war. All those samurai, all those armies, all that military infrastructure. It wasn't going to just disappear now that peace had come to Japan. Ambitious warlords would look for new wars, new conquests, and Korea, sitting right there across the strait, rich and relatively unprepared, would be an obvious target. Yi couldn't have known that Toyotomi Hideyoshi would be the one to launch the invasion, couldn't have predicted the exact year it would come, but he knew it was coming, and he spent years preparing for a war that nobody else believed would happen. By 1591, Yi had risen to the rank of Left Naval Commander of Jeolla Province. It wasn't the highest naval position in Korea. That belonged to Admiral Won-gyun, who commanded the southeast region. But it gave Yi control over enough ships and resources to implement his ideas on a larger scale. And this is when he built his secret weapon, the turtle ship. The turtle ship, or Gyeobukseon in Korean, was unlike anything the world had seen before. Yi didn't invent the concept from scratch. There were records of armoured ships being used in Korea centuries before. But those earlier designs had fallen out of use. Yi resurrected the idea and completely reimagined it for 16th century warfare. The turtle ship was essentially a heavily modified panoxion with a covered deck, but calling it just a covered deck doesn't capture the genius of the design. The entire top of the ship was shielded with thick wooden planking, creating a roof over the crew and rowers. This roof was then studded with iron spikes, hexagonal plates covered in sharp metal points. The spikes served two purposes. First, they prevented enemy soldiers from boarding. Any samurai trying to jump onto a turtle ship would impale himself on the spikes. Second, Yi would often cover the spikes with empty rice sacks to disguise them. Japanese boarding parties would leap onto what they thought was a normal wooden deck and discover the spikes the hard way. The front of the turtle ship featured a dragon's head mounted on the bow. This wasn't just decorative. The dragon's head concealed a cannon that could fire directly forward, and the mouth could also emit sulfur smoke, creating a smoke screen that hid the ship's movements and terrified enemy sailors who had never seen such a thing. But the real innovation was the firepower. The turtle ship carried between 24 and 36 cannons, positioned along the sides and at the front and back. Gun ports allowed the cannons to fire in nearly any direction. The ship could pull alongside an enemy vessel and devastate it with broadside cannon fire, or it could charge straight at an enemy formation, cannons blazing from the dragon's mouth, and smash through their line before they could respond. The cannons themselves were impressive. Korean cannon technology in the 1590s was actually more advanced than what the Japanese were using. Korea had several types of cannons, each designed for different purposes. The Kyeonja or heaven cannons were heavy guns with long range and devastating power. The Jija or earth cannons were medium weight with good accuracy. The Hyonja or black cannons were lighter, faster firing weapons. The Hwangja or yellow cannons were the lightest, used for anti-personnel work. And the Seungja or victory cannons were essentially large arquebuses with a range of about 200 meters, perfect for shredding enemy deck crews. Yi's turtle ships also had crews that knew how to use all this firepower. He personally supervised the training. Gunnery drills were conducted daily. His crews could reload and fire faster than any other naval force in East Asia. When the Japanese invasion finally came, they would discover that fighting a turtle ship was like fighting a floating fortress that could shoot in all directions and couldn't be boarded. Yi built his first turtle ship in 1591. He tested it extensively, running it through simulations of every combat scenario he could imagine. On March 27, 1592, he he launched it officially, declaring it ready for combat. 1 day later, the Japanese invaded Korea. Yi's timing was either incredibly lucky or disturbingly prescient. But here's the crucial thing to understand about the turtle ships. They were never the main force of Yi's fleet. They were shock weapons, psychological tools. Yi typically only deployed 3 to 5 turtle ships in any given battle, and he used them for specific purposes. They would spearhead attacks, charging into enemy formations to break them apart. They would serve as rallying points, visible symbols of Korean power that boosted his sailors' morale. And they would hunt high-value targets, seeking out enemy flagship and commanders to decapitate the Japanese command structure. The bulk of Yi's victories came from his standard Panoxion warships, crewed by sailors he had trained, positioned, using the tactical genius he had spent years developing. The turtle ships were spectacular, yes. They got the attention, the legends, the stories, but Yi won his battles through preparation, training, and strategic brilliance. When the Japanese invasion came in 1592, Yi was serving as the left naval commander of Jeolla province. Essentially, he controlled the southwestern section of Korea's naval forces. While the army was collapsing on land, Yi began his own campaign at sea. And this is where the legend truly begins. Between May 1592 and the end of that year, Admiral Yi fought in 16 naval battles against the Japanese fleet. He won all 16. Not just one, he annihilated the enemy forces he encountered. At the Battle of Okpo, he destroyed 26 Japanese ships without losing a single vessel. At the Battle of Sacheon, he unveiled his secret weapon, the turtle ship, a revolutionary warship covered in thick wooden planking, studded with iron spikes, bristling with cannons on all sides, virtually impervious to Japanese boarding tactics. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. At the Battle of Hansen Island in August 1592, Yi commanded what military historians still study as one of the most perfectly executed naval ambushments in history. He lured 73 Japanese ships into open water, then used a tactic called the crane wing formation to surround them. His fleet formed a massive semicircle, the heavy Panoxion warships on the flanks, cannons firing from hundreds of meters away. The Japanese, whose naval tactics relied on getting close enough to board enemy ships for hand-to-hand combat, found themselves helplessly outranged. They couldn't close the distance. They couldn't escape the encirclement. They were massacred. 59 of the 73 ships were destroyed. The survivors limped back to Busan with reports that made Japanese commanders rethink their entire invasion strategy. For 5 years, Admiral Yi controlled the seas around Korea. The Japanese, despite their success on land, could never secure their supply lines. Every convoy was vulnerable. Every attempt to move reinforcements by water ended in disaster. Their armies in the north began to run short of food, ammunition, and morale. The quick conquest that Hideyoshi had promised was turning into a grinding stalemate. Yi's success made him a national hero. Songs were sung about him. The king sent personal commendations. Common people believed he was invincible, but success also made him enemies at the royal court. This is where the story takes a dark turn. In the royal court, far from the battles, jealous officials and rival commanders whispered that Yi was too successful, too independent, too dangerous. One of these rivals was Admiral Won-gyun, who commanded the navy in the southeast. Won-gyun resented serving under Yi's shadow. He wanted the glory, the recognition, the command of the entire Korean navy, and he was willing to use court politics to get it. In 1597, a Japanese double agent fed false intelligence to the Korean court. The report claimed that a specific Japanese commander would be sailing through a certain area with a small escort, an easy target, ripe for ambush. The king ordered Yi to attack, but Yi, studying the intelligence carefully, realized it was a trap. The route made no sense. The timing was suspicious. If he took his fleet there, he'd be sailing into a Japanese ambush with the entire Korean navy vulnerable. Yi refused the order. He sent a detailed report explaining why the intelligence was false. why the mission would be suicide, why the Navy needed to stay in defensive positions. He was correct in every detail, but at court his refusal was seen as insubordination. Admiral Won-gyun saw his opportunity. He whispered to the king that Yi had become cowardly, that he was refusing to fight, that a real commander would follow orders without question. King Seonjo, already frustrated by the war's stalemate, furious at having to flee his own capital, took the bait. In April 1597, he ordered Yi Sun-sin arrested on charges of cowardice and treason. The admiral who had never lost a battle, who had single-handedly prevented the Japanese from controlling Korea's waters, was dragged to the capital in chains. He was tortured, his family was disgraced, and he was seconds away from execution when a few loyal officials managed to convince the king that killing your most successful admiral during a war might not be the wisest decision. Instead, Yi was demoted to the rank of a common foot soldier and sent to serve in the army under General Gwon-yul. Admiral Won-gyun, the man who had engineered Yi's downfall, was promoted to command the entire Korean Navy. Every ship, every officer, the full weight of Korea's naval defense. Won-gyun took command of 166 warships. The fleet that Yi had carefully built, trained, and led to victory after victory, and Won-gyun promptly destroyed it all in a single catastrophic battle. On August 28, 1597, at the Battle of Chilcheolyang, Won-gyun led the Korean fleet into a Japanese ambush. It was the exact scenario Yi had warned about. The Japanese had lured the Korean Navy into narrow waters, surrounded them with superior numbers, and massacred them. 153 Korean warships were sunk or captured. Thousands of sailors died. Won-gyun himself was killed. In one afternoon, 5 years of Yi's careful work was obliterated. When news of the disaster reached the king, he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The Korean Navy, the only force that had consistently defeated the Japanese, was gone. The Yellow Sea lay open. Japanese supply lines were now secure. Their armies on land could be reinforced at will. The war, which had been a grinding stalemate, suddenly tilted decisively in Japan's favour. In desperation, King Seonjo sent orders to find Yi Sun-sin, wherever he was serving as a common soldier, and reinstate him immediately. The message was brutally honest. Fix this. Save the Navy, save Korea, or there will be nothing left to save. When Yi received his orders, he travelled to the port of Jindo to survey what remained of the Korean fleet. What he found would have broken most commanders. Out of 166 warships that had existed just weeks before, only 13 had survived. 13 ships. Some had fled the massacre at Chilcheolyang. A few had been away on other duties. Most were battered, undermanned, and filled with sailors who had just watched their comrades die in the worst naval defeat in Korean history. The sailors who remained were terrified. They had just seen what happened when you fought the Japanese fleet. They knew the enemy had over 300 ships. They knew this was suicide. Some captains openly suggested they should abandon the ships, join the army on land, and fight there where the odds were at least comprehensible. King Seonjo, reading the reports, came to the same conclusion. He sent Yi a letter that essentially said, "It's over. Disband the navy. Burn the ships if you have to. Bring the sailors to the army. We'll fight them on land." Admiral Yi's response has become one of the most famous moments in Korean history. He wrote back, "Your Majesty still has 12 warships. As long as I am alive, the enemy will never dare to despise us." 12 ships. He later acquired one more, bringing his fleet to 13, against 333 Japanese vessels, a 25-1 disadvantage. No turtle ships, those had all been destroyed at Chilcheolyang. No veteran crews, most of his best sailors were dead. No support from the army, they were busy defending the interior. Just 13 ships, a few hundred frightened sailors, and the tactical genius of the one man who had never lost a battle. Yi understood that fighting conventionally was impossible. If he tried to engage the Japanese fleet in open water, they would surround him, board his ships, and overwhelm his crews with superior numbers. His only chance was to make the battlefield itself his weapon. He needed a place where the Japanese numerical advantage became a liability, where their ships would get in each other's way, where he could control the flow of battle. He studied the coastline with obsessive detail. He consulted with local fishermen about currents and tides. He sent scouts to measure depths and map underwater rocks. And eventually, he found his battlefield, the Myeongnyang Strait between Jindo Island and the southwestern tip of the Korean mainland. The strait was perfect, or more accurately, it was perfectly terrible for the Japanese. At its narrowest point, the passage was only about 300 meters wide. But the real genius of the location was what you couldn't see from the surface. The strait had tidal currents that flowed at nearly 10 knots, fast enough to carry a ship along, whether it wanted to go or not. And these currents reversed direction every 3 hours, south to north, then north to south, with tremendous force. Yi realized he could weaponize the tide. If he positioned his fleet at the northern end of the strait, anchored in calm water, he could wait for the Japanese to enter. The Japanese would enter when the tide was favorable, flowing north, carrying them through the strait toward Yi's position. They'd be confident, surging forward with the current behind them, hundreds of ships pouring through the narrow passage. And then, Yi just needed to hold them. Fight defensively. Trade blows with the vanguard, keep them engaged, and wait for the tide to turn. When that current reversed, everything would change. The Japanese ships that had pushed through would suddenly find themselves fighting the current, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat. Ships behind them would slam into ships ahead as the water reversed. Their formation would collapse into chaos, and Yi's heavier, more maneuverable Panoxian warships, designed specifically for coastal combat, would have them at their mercy. It was brilliant. It was also terrifying, because it meant Yi had to fight the Japanese Navy's vanguard alone until the tide turned. His 13 ships would have to hold position against the initial assault, taking fire, taking casualties, watching hundreds of enemy ships bear down on them, and not break, not flee, not give an inch. And there was another problem. His sailors knew they were outnumbered 25-1. They had just watched the massacre at Chilcholyang. Some of them had been there. They were traumatized, exhausted, and convinced this was a suicide mission. Yi needed to convince them to fight. But how do you convince men to face impossible odds? On October 25th, the day before the battle, Yi assembled his officers and made his pitch. It wasn't a speech about honor or glory or dying for your kingdom. It was much more direct. He said, "Gentlemen, we are in a narrow strait. The Japanese have numbers, but in this place they cannot use them. They must come at us in small groups. Our ships are stronger. Our cannons have longer range. We will anchor at the north end, and we will destroy every ship that comes through. If we fight, we can win. If we run, we die. So I suggest we fight." Then he said something else, something that military historians still quote when teaching leadership. He said, "One man blocking a narrow pass can hold off 1,000. We have 13 ships blocking a narrow strait. That means we are more than a match for any force that tries to come through. The question is not whether we can win. The question is whether you have the courage to find out." Still, many of his officers were skeptical. They wanted to run. They wanted to abandon the ships, retreat inland, save themselves. So Yi made a decision that defined his leadership style. He didn't argue with them anymore. He didn't try to convince them. He simply announced that his flagship would advance to the southern edge of the strait the next morning, alone if necessary, and engage the enemy. Whether the rest of the fleet followed was up to them. It was a calculated gamble. Yi knew that Korean naval culture valued loyalty above almost everything else. He knew that watching their admiral sail alone into battle while they stayed behind would be unbearable for most of these men. He was betting his life that shame and honor would overcome fear. He was right. On the morning of October 26, 1597, as Yi's flagship began moving south toward the Strait, the other 12 ships fell in behind him. Slowly, reluctantly, but they came. 13 Korean Panoksion warships, battered and undermanned, positioning themselves at the northern mouth of the Myeongnyang Strait. Behind them, nothing. No reinforcements, no second line, no retreat. Ahead of them, the horizon filled with Japanese sails. The Japanese fleet began moving toward the strait. Over 300 ships, massive formations of Sekibune warships in the vanguard. The Japanese middle-class warships designed for ramming and boarding. Behind them, the larger Atakabune vessels and hundreds of support ships carrying supplies, soldiers, and ammunition. Their drums beat a steady rhythm. Their commanders stood at the prows of their ships, already savouring victory. Leading the Japanese fleet was Admiral Kurashima Michifusa, one of Japan's most experienced naval commanders. He had fought in nearly every major naval battle of the invasion. He knew Admiral Yi's reputation, but he also knew the mathematics. Kurashima had at least 133 warships under his command, with another 200 support vessels. Yi had 13. The outcome was inevitable. This would be a footnote in history, the destruction of the last Korean resistance at sea. As the Japanese fleet approached the southern entrance to the strait, Yi gave his orders. His fleet anchored at the northern end, just beyond the strait's exit. The Korean ships formed a defensive line, cannons loaded, archers ready, and waited. And here's where Admiral Yi broke every rule of naval warfare. In every previous battle, he had moved aggressively. He had maneuvered. He had used tactics like the crane wing formation to surround and destroy enemy fleets. But today, he didn't move. He just sat there, his flagship directly in the centre. The other 12 ships spread in a line to either side, anchored, motionless. The Japanese commanders must have thought it was a mistake, or perhaps desperation. Here was the great Admiral Yi, the man who had destroyed their fleets time and again, just sitting still like a target. Kurashima ordered the vanguard forward. Dozens of ships entered the strait, the current behind them, carrying them north at tremendous speed. And still, Yi didn't move. His ship sat there, cannons silent, waiting. The Japanese fleet surged closer. 50 meters, 40 meters, close enough now that archers on both sides could start firing. And suddenly Yi's flagship erupted in a storm of cannon fire. Not just from the front, from the sides, from gun ports all along the hull. The Korean Panoksion warships were designed with cannons positioned to fire in every direction. While Japanese ships relied on boarding tactics, Korean vessels were floating artillery platforms, and they had been waiting for the Japanese to get into point-blank range. The leading Japanese ships took the full broadside. Wooden hulls shattered, masts toppled. The first wave of enemy vessels staggered under the bombardment, but they kept coming. There were too many of them. For every ship that fell, 3 more pushed forward. The Japanese Sekibune tried to close the distance, tried to get alongside Yi's flagship, where their samurai could board and turn this into a melee fight. But Yi's ship was bigger, heavier, built with a flat bottom that made it incredibly stable as a gun platform. The Japanese ships that got close found themselves unable to match its height. Their boarding ramps couldn't reach. Their samurai couldn't climb up. And all the while, Korean cannons fired down into them at near point-blank range, devastating their decks, tearing through their hulls below the waterline. For almost an hour, Yi's flagship fought alone. The other 12 Korean ships, watching their admiral take the full weight of the Japanese assault, finally overcame their fear. One by one, they moved forward. Slowly at first, then with growing confidence. They formed up around Yi's flagship, adding their cannons to the barrage. The northern mouth of the strait became a wall of fire and smoke, but the Japanese kept coming. Dozens of ships pushed through the strait, carried by the current, packed together in the narrow passage. And this is where Yi's strategy began to work. In the confined space of the strait, The Japanese couldn't maneuver. They couldn't spread out. They couldn't bring their full numbers to bear. Only a handful of ships could fight at the front line at any given moment. The rest were stuck behind, watching, unable to help. Their massive numerical advantage was neutralized by geography. Korean archers fired from elevated positions on their ships, raining arrows down on the packed Japanese vessels. Cannons fired specialized ammunition, wooden bolts several feet long with iron tips, designed to punch through hulls and cause catastrophic flooding. The Kyeonja heaven cannons, the Jija earth cannons, the Hwangja yellow cannons, each type had different ranges and purposes, and Yi's crews had trained for years to use them with devastating precision. The Japanese commanders began to realize something was wrong. They were taking heavy casualties. Their ships couldn't close. The current was pushing them into killing range, but not letting them get close enough to board. And then, the tide changed. It happened gradually at first. The water in the strait began to slow its northward rush. Then it stopped. Then with gathering force it reversed. Now the current was flowing south, back toward the Japanese fleet, still trying to push through. Chaos. Japanese ships that had been surging forward suddenly found themselves being pushed backward. Captains shouted orders to their rowers, but rowing against a 10-knot current is nearly impossible. Ships collided. Vessels that had been in formation slammed into each other as the water shoved them together. The strait became a tangle of ships, unable to maneuver, unable to advance, unable to retreat, and the Korean cannons never stopped firing. Now Yi ordered his fleet forward. Not aggressively, not into the mass of Japanese ships, but just enough to maintain optimal cannon range. The Korean ships, anchored and stable, could adjust their positions precisely. The Japanese ships, caught in the reversing current, were helpless targets. The battle lasted for several more hours. The Japanese tried everything. They tried ramming. They tried boarding. They tried focusing all their fire on Yi's flagship, hoping that killing the Korean admiral would break the defense. Admiral Kurashima himself, commanding from his ornate flagship, pushed to the front, shouting orders, trying to rally his forces. Korean archers spotted his elaborate armor, marked him as a high-value target, and concentrated their fire. Kurashima fell, struck by multiple arrows. His body, weighed down by his armor, tumbled into the water. Korean sailors fished his corpse out. They severed his head and mounted it on a pike at the front of Ye's flagship, where every Japanese sailor could see it. The psychological effect was immediate. The commander of the Japanese fleet was dead, killed in what was supposed to be an easy victory. Morale collapsed. By late afternoon, as the tide began to change again, the Japanese fleet retreated. They had lost 31 ships destroyed or so badly damaged they were scuttled. Hundreds of sailors were dead. Their remaining vessels were battered, leaking, and demoralized. The great armada that was supposed to sweep aside the last Korean resistance had been stopped cold by 13 ships defending a narrow strait. Korean casualties, 10 sailors wounded, 0 ships lost. Admiral Yi had done it. Against 25-1 odds, he had held the Myeongnyang Strait. The Japanese navy, which had been sailing confidently toward the Yellow Sea, turned around and retreated to Busan. Their land armies, expecting naval support for their advance on Seoul, suddenly found themselves without secure supply lines again. The conquest of Korea, which had seemed inevitable just days before, stalled. In his report to the king, Yi downplayed the victory. He wrote that he had been fortunate to gain a small victory, and that the battle had blunted Japanese momentum. A small victory. 13 ships against 333. One of the most lopsided military victories in human history, and Yi called it a small victory. But the impact was enormous. Surviving Korean sailors who had fled after Chilcholyang, hearing that Yi was back, and that he had just destroyed a Japanese fleet with only 13 ships, began returning. Within weeks, Yi's fleet grew to over 50 vessels. The Chinese Ming dynasty, which had been reluctant to commit their navy after the disaster, at Chilcholiang now felt confident sending reinforcements. By early 1598, the combined Korean-Chinese fleet had hundreds of ships. The Battle of Myeongnyang became a turning point. The Japanese, who had controlled the seas and were planning their final push to conquer all of Korea, were thrown back on the defensive. Their supply lines were vulnerable again. Their armies began suffering from lack of food and ammunition. The war dragged on for another year, but Japanese momentum was broken. The psychological impact on both sides cannot be overstated. For the Koreans, Myeongnyang proved that the Japanese were not invincible. That careful planning, good leadership, and brave sailors could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Morale, which had collapsed after Chilcholiang, surged back. Volunteers flocked to join Yi's fleet. Sailors who had deserted out of fear returned, ashamed of having abandoned their posts when their admiral was performing miracles. For the Japanese, Myeongnyang was a shock to their entire strategic framework. They had spent 5 years trying to control Korea's waters. They had built hundreds of ships. They had committed enormous resources to their navy, and in one afternoon, a tiny Korean force had stopped them cold. Worse, they had done it by killing one of Japan's most experienced admirals and humiliating the entire Japanese fleet in the process. Japanese naval commanders became hesitant, cautious. They knew Admiral Yi was out there, somewhere, waiting for them to make a mistake. That fear was paralyzing. The ripple effects extended to the land campaign as well. Japanese armies in Korea depended on naval supply lines. When Yi controlled the seas, those supply lines became vulnerable. Convoys had to travel with heavy escorts, which meant fewer ships available for offensive operations. Ports had to be heavily defended, which tied down troops that could have been used at the front. The Japanese found themselves fighting a two-front war against the Korean and Chinese armies on land and against Admiral Yi at sea, and they were losing both fronts. In November 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the Japanese warlord who had started this entire invasion, died. His death effectively ended Japanese ambitions in Korea. The various Japanese commanders who had been loyal to Hideyoshi had no interest in continuing a costly war that was going nowhere. They began negotiating withdrawals, pulling their armies back to coastal strongholds, preparing to evacuate back to Japan. But the Korean and Chinese forces weren't willing to let them leave peacefully. They wanted to destroy the Japanese forces completely, to make such a devastating statement that Japan would never consider invading Korea again. And that meant one final massive naval battle. On December 16, 1598, Admiral Yi commanded his last battle. The Battle of Myeongnyang, fought in the Strait of the same name, pitted a combined Korean-Chinese fleet of over 500 ships against a Japanese fleet of over 500 vessels trying to retreat to Japan. It was the largest naval battle of the entire war. Yi, commanding from his flagship, coordinated a complex attack that caught the Japanese fleet in a crossfire. Wave after wave of Allied ships struck the Japanese from multiple directions. By the end of the day, over 200 Japanese ships had been sunk or captured. It was total victory. But during the battle, as Yi stood on his command deck directing operations, a stray arquebus ball struck him in the chest. The wound was fatal. He knew it immediately. But he also knew that if word of his death spread during the battle, it could break the morale of his fleet. So his last words were instructions to his officers. The war is at its height. Beat my war drums. Do not announce my death. His son and nephew held him as he died, then covered his body and continued giving orders in his name. The Korean fleet didn't learn their admiral was dead until the battle was won. Admiral Yi Sun-sin died having never lost a naval battle. 23 engagements over 7 years, 23 victories. His record is unmatched in the history of naval warfare. Not just in Korea, not just in Asia, anywhere, ever. So how did he do it? How did 13 ships hold off an armada? Let's break down the tactical genius of the Battle of Myeongnyang in detail, because understanding how Yi won reveals principles of warfare that are still relevant today. First and foremost, terrain as force multiplier. Yi chose his battlefield with surgical precision. The Myeongnyang Strait wasn't just narrow, it was specifically narrow enough that the Japanese couldn't bring their numerical advantage to bear. With only about 300 meters of width at the narrowest point, maybe 20 to 30 ships could fight side by side at most. The Japanese had over 300 vessels, but only a fraction could engage at any given time. The rest were stuck behind, useless. This is a fundamental principle of military strategy. Force your enemy to fight in conditions where their advantages become liabilities. Military historians call this tactical parity. If you're outnumbered 10 to 1 in open terrain, you'll probably lose. But if you can force the fight into a narrow passage where only one enemy at a time can engage you, suddenly the numbers matter much less. Medieval castles used this principle with narrow staircases and doorways, mountain passes, urban warfare. Anywhere you can channel the enemy into a killing ground, where numbers don't help them. Yi understood this intuitively. He looked at the strategic situation, 13 ships versus hundreds, and realized that fighting conventionally would be suicide. So he changed the conditions of the battle itself. He made the battlefield work for him instead of against him. Second, timing as weapon. The reversing tidal current was absolutely critical to Yi's victory. But here's what's remarkable. Yi didn't just notice that the currents reversed. Every sailor in Korea knew the tides reversed. What Yi did was calculate exactly how long he needed to hold the Japanese in place before the tide turned. He needed to keep them engaged, keep them pushing through the strait, keep them committed to the battle for just long enough that when the current reversed, they'd be trapped. This required incredible nerve. Yi had to absorb the initial Japanese assault, take casualties, watch enemy ships swarm his position, and not break, not retreat, not give ground. Because if his line collapsed before the tide turned, the Japanese would pursue into open water where their numbers would overwhelm him. He had to hold for, 2 hours? 3? The margin for error was razor thin, and he did it. His flagship fought alone for almost an hour, absorbing the full weight of the Japanese vanguard, giving his other ships time to find their courage. Then the full Korean line engaged, trading blows with dozens of enemy vessels, taking fire, taking losses, but holding position. And when the tide finally turned, when that current reversed and the Japanese formation dissolved into chaos, Yi struck. That's timing. That's understanding not just what you need to do, but when you need to do it. Third, technology and training. The Korean Panokseon warships were specifically designed for this kind of coastal artillery combat. Flat-bottomed for stability, multiple decks to separate rowers from fighters, gun ports positioned for all-around fire. These weren't features that Yi invented on the spot. They were the result of years of careful design and modification. Yi had spent his entire career improving Korean naval technology, turning good ships into excellent ones. And the crews. Yi's sailors weren't just competent, they were drilled to perfection. They could reload cannons faster than any other navy in East Asia. They could maintain formation under fire. They could coordinate their fire to concentrate on specific targets. This wasn't natural talent. This was the result of years of training, of Yi running practice battles and mock engagements, of endless drills until his crews could perform complex maneuvers automatically. Modern military forces call this training to standard. You don't just teach soldiers how to do something once, you drill them until they can do it perfectly under the worst possible conditions, when cannons are firing, when ships are on fire, when half your crew is wounded and you're outnumbered 25 to 1. That's when training matters, and Yi's crews performed flawlessly. So how did Admiral Yi do it? How did 13 ships hold off an armada? First, terrain. Yi chose his battlefield with surgical precision. The Myeongnyang Strait wasn't just narrow, it was a natural choke point where numbers became a liability. The Japanese couldn't bring their full force to bear. Only a few ships could fight at the front line, while hundreds sat behind, useless. Yi turned geography into a weapon. Second, timing. The reversing tidal current was the key. Yi didn't need to destroy the entire Japanese fleet. He just needed to hold them in place until the tide changed. Once that current reversed, the Japanese formation collapsed. Ships that had been advancing suddenly found themselves pushed backward into their own fleet. Collisions, chaos, a perfect target for Korean cannons. Third, technology. The Korean Panoxion warships were specifically designed for this kind of fight. Flat-bottomed for stability, multiple decks to separate rowers from fighters, cannons positioned to fire in all directions. The Japanese relied on boarding tactics, but Yi's ships were built to keep them at range and destroy them with artillery. The technological advantage compensated for the numerical disadvantage. Fourth, psychological warfare. When Yi fought alone with his flagship for that first hour, he wasn't being reckless. He was making a statement. He was showing the Japanese that Korean ships could absorb their best attacks and keep fighting. He was showing his own sailors that the Japanese were not invincible. And when he mounted Kuroshima's head on a pike for all to see, he broke Japanese morale. But perhaps most importantly, leadership. Yi understood that his sailors were terrified. He didn't try to pretend the odds weren't terrible. He acknowledged the danger, but then he made them believe that in this specific place, under these specific conditions, they could win. He led from the front. He risked his own life first. He gave his men something more powerful than hope. He gave them a plan they could believe in. The Battle of Myeongnyang has been studied in military academies around the world ever since. The United States Naval Academy teaches it as an example of using terrain to defeat superior numbers. The British Royal Navy uses it as a case study in defensive positioning. Even the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force studies the battle, not to learn how to win, but to understand how overconfidence and poor tactical awareness can turn overwhelming advantage into humiliating defeat. Admiral Yi would go on to fight more battles. In December 1598, at the Battle of Myeongnyang, he commanded a combined Korean-Chinese fleet against a massive Japanese force trying to retreat back to Japan. It was the final major naval battle of the war. The Allied fleet destroyed or captured over 200 Japanese ships in what military historians call one of the most decisive naval victories ever recorded. But during the battle, a stray bullet struck Yi in the chest. He died on the deck of his flagship, urging his officers to hide his death until the battle was won so his sailors wouldn't lose morale. Korea's greatest naval commander died having never lost a single battle. In 23 naval engagements, over 7 years, Admiral Yi Sun-sin achieved victory in all 23. His record is unmatched in naval history. And the Battle of Myeongnyang, 13 ships holding back 333, stands as perhaps the most impossible of all his victories. Today, Admiral Yi is a national hero in Korea. Statues stand in his honor. Warships are named after him. The 2014 South Korean film, The Admiral Roaring Currents, which dramatized the Battle of Myeongnyang, became the highest-grossing film in Korean cinema history, watched by over 17 million people. A 2022 sequel, Hansan Rising Dragon, covered the Battle of Hansan Island. A third, film in 2023, Myeongnyang Deadly Sea, depicted his final battle. The trilogy has introduced new generations to Yi's story and cemented his place as one of history's greatest military commanders. Military historians rank him alongside figures like Horatio Nelson, Themistocles, and Michiel de Ruyter. Some argue he surpasses them all. Nelson, Britain's greatest admiral, won the Battle of Trafalgar with a 2-3 disadvantage. Impressive, but nowhere near 25-1. Themistocles at Salamis had terrain advantage, but fought with roughly equal numbers. Yi fought outnumbered in every major battle, and never lost. His war diary, the Nanjung Ilgi, written during the 7 years of the Japanese invasions, survives as a primary historical source. Historians have combed through it for insights into Yi's thinking, his tactics, his leadership philosophy. What they find is a man who combined brilliant strategic vision with almost obsessive attention to detail. Yi didn't just understand naval warfare, he understood weather, tides, logistics, morale, politics, technology. He was a complete commander. But the Battle of Myeongnyang, that remains special. It's the moment when everything was on the line, when the odds were most impossible, when conventional wisdom said to give up, disband the fleet, and accept defeat. And Yi looked at those odds and said, "No, I have 13 ships, and as long as I'm alive, the enemy will never be safe." He meant it, and he proved it. The legacy of Myeongnyang extends beyond just military tactics. It's become a cultural touchstone for Korea, a reminder that numbers aren't everything, that courage and intelligence can overcome overwhelming force, that one determined leader with a clear plan can change history. When modern Koreans face impossible odds, they remember Admiral Yi. When soldiers are outnumbered, they think of those 13 ships. When leaders need to inspire their teams, they quote Yi's letter to the king. "I still have 12 warships, and I am still alive." The Strait itself is now a national landmark. Tourists visit to see where the battle took place. The currents still reverse every 3 hours, just as they did on October 26, 1597. Standing there, watching the water change direction, you can almost imagine it. 13 ships anchored at the northern end, 333 enemy vessels pouring through the narrow passage, cannons firing, drums beating, and one admiral who refused to accept that some battles cannot be won. The Japanese learned an important lesson that day. Naval power isn't just about numbers, it's about leadership, tactics, preparation, and terrain. They had more ships, more men, more resources, but Admiral Yi had something more valuable. He had a perfect understanding of his battlefield and the courage to use it. In the years since, military strategists have tried to break down exactly how Yi achieved his victory. They've run computer simulations, they've studied the tidal patterns, they've analysed the ship designs, the cannon ranges, the formation tactics, and what they consistently find is that everything had to go almost perfectly for Yi to win. The tides had to reverse exactly when they did. His sailors had to hold their nerve despite being outnumbered. His flagship had to absorb yet incredible punishment for that first hour. The Japanese had to push aggressively into the Strait instead of waiting for better conditions. Any one of those factors going wrong would have meant disaster. Yi was operating on the absolute edge of possibility, but he had calculated every risk. He had prepared for every contingency, and when the moment came, he executed his plan flawlessly. This is what separates great commanders from merely good ones. Good commanders win battles when the odds are in their favour. Great commanders find ways to win, even when every calculation says they should lose. Admiral Yi, commanding 13 ships against 333, achieved something that military historians still struggle to fully explain. Not because the tactics are mysterious, they're actually quite clear when you break them down, but because the audacity of even attempting such a defence takes your breath away. The Battle of Myeongnyang wasn't just a naval victory, it was a testament to human determination. It was proof that sometimes the most unlikely outcome is the one that happens. It was a reminder that, in war, as in life, courage and intelligence matter more than raw numbers. Admiral Yi Sun-sin died believing he had simply done his duty. He never sought glory, he never promoted his own legend. After Myeongnyang, when the king wanted to honour him with titles and land, Yi asked instead for resources to rebuild the navy and protect the kingdom. When officials at court tried to claim credit for the victory, Yi didn't argue. He just went back to his ships and continued preparing for the next battle. But history remembers. History always remembers men and women who achieve the impossible. And on October 26, 1597, in a narrow strait off the coast of Jindo Island, Admiral Yi Sun-sin achieved something that will never be forgotten. 13 ships, 333 enemies, 0 losses, total victory. The greatest naval commander in history, fighting his greatest battle, achieving his most impossible victory. This is the legacy of the Battle of Myeongnyang. This is the story of Admiral Yi Sun-sin. And this is proof that sometimes, against all odds, 13 ships are enough, if they're commanded by the right man.